So as the sign says, welcome to tropical biodiversity at the University of Reading. This is a little glasshouse at the top of the complex, which, as the name suggests, specialises in growing tropical plants. Many of these plants are food plants, so we're just going to take a bit of a tour around and see how many things there are in here that you might recognise in other contexts. So, starting off at the very front, you can see that there are pepper plants here. Peppers are traditionally a South American plant. And you can see tiny little bell peppers. Again, perhaps not quite the type that you would find in the supermarket, and that gives you an idea about how difficult it is to grow the specimens that we normally see in the supermarket. And then I'm just going to show you the name tags so that you can remember what we're talking about. So this is cassava, and you may know it as cassava itself, but you may remember it as a food substance called tapioca. If you're as old as me, you remember tapioca as school dinners into the most revolting pudding, which they used to try and force down our throats every week. But cassava itself is really widely eaten around the world, and the part of the plant that you eat is actually the roots. And it's a starchy staple in many parts of the world, and you'll find a lot of the plants in here are core food plants for different communities. So as our starchy staples, we tend to rely on cereal crops. Obviously we're familiar with rice as well, but in many parts of the world they rely on things like cassava as their primary starch source. Here we're into more exotic fruits, so I'm going to show you papaya, also known as pawpaw. And these are in a nice green state. Been a very good crop of them this year. As you can see, quite a tall plant, and if I come up to the top you can see the flowers just growing there. So this is growing at the University of Reading, and we've got a very exotic plant bearing some pretty good looking fruit in this tree. And then if we work our way around, we can see other staple food crops of the world. Pineapple, you're probably all familiar with, probably using a tin. Pineapple actually grows as a little plant. The label's actually almost the best illustration of it. And it's a bromeliad, and the pineapple itself sits at the centre of the plant. The one here currently isn't flowering, but you'll be able to see its leaves, and usually the pineapple will grow down in the base there and will sit there as looking exactly like the pineapples that you see in the shops. Arrowroot is over the back. So arrowroot, again, you use the rhizome, the root part of the plant. It's a fairly unexciting looking plant to look at. An arrowroot is used as a thickener in many things. It's an equivalent to cornflower. And then if we move a little bit further along, I wonder how many of you recognise this plant here. Very tall, quite spindly, and you almost certainly eat quite a lot of it. It's sugarcane, and much of the sugar that you buy and consume will be made from sugarcane. There is a move in the UK, and most of the UK sugar actually produced by British Sugar is made from sugar beet, which is a totally different type of plant, but it has a storage organ that grows underground that is very rich in sugar. And so in the UK we try and source most of our sugar internally, but we still do import a lot from other parts of the world where sugarcane is the primary source. The other use for sugarcane, of course, is as a biofuel for bioethanol. So here's a plant that you might be familiar with, although it's not in the best of health. This is sweet potato. Sweet potato is no relation to the normal potato that you might buy for chips. It's much lower in starch, actually, potentially better for you. Some countries eat the leaves in salads. So in Portugal, for example, they'll eat some of the potato leaves. Clearly you wouldn't eat these leaves because they're completely demolished by various pests which are also crawling around on the floor. If we come down through the canopy, then you can start to see some of the sweet potatoes themselves just sitting below the surface of the soil. So it is an underground crop. Growing next to it is something called taro, which you probably haven't heard of. And again, this is a starchy staple. It originates from Indonesia, tends to be consumed in Africa and Asia, and Again, it's the underground parts of the plant that are consumed, and they contain about 50% starch, and they weigh somewhere between 4 and 9 pounds in weight. So it's a pretty substantial root, and in many parts of the world, again, it's used as a starchy staple in the diet. So one of the things that often comes from tropical climates are herbs and spices. You might recognise this as lemongrass, has a wonderful lemony scent, and you can use it chopped up a lot in Asian cooking in particular. Next to that, we have some turmeric. So turmeric, when you see it, is normally a bright yellow spice. It's prepared from the rhizome, so the underground parts of the plant again. Many of the trading elements of the world, the world's economy, developed on the basis of the spice trade, and spices were a really important part of developing the economy that we know today. Probably the most popular spice that's consumed in the UK is black peppercorns, and they grow as these little tiny reproductive structures, but you can see it sticking up from the branch on this plant. And black pepper is one of the most heavily traded commodities, or certainly it was in the spice trade across the world. It was part of the development of the British economy that we know today. Hopefully many of you know what this plant is. It's a starchy staple that I'm sure that nearly everybody is familiar with. It's rice, and you can see that the rice grains grow on these panicles, and individual grains. This one's about ready to harvest. What you might also notice is that in some cases you have panicles here where not all the grains are ripened at the same time. This can be for a variety of reasons. It can be because some of the grains didn't develop properly, and it can be because the plant experienced a temperature shock at the time of flowering, and that can massively affect grain set. It's one of the problems that we're facing as a consequence of climate change, is that plants are often exposed to sudden climatic events. It's actually relatively straightforward to try and breed a plant that could deal with consistently, say, more droughted or higher temperatures, but it's really difficult to breed plants that can deal with sudden changes in temperature and big fluctuations in the environment in which they grow. So one of the plants or the fruit plants that you're really familiar with, I'm sure, is banana. You might not be quite so familiar with this banana, which, as you can see, is red, little clusters of red bananas. One of the curiosities perhaps you should notice is that all banana plants grow with the hands pointing upwards and not downwards as many people think. Banana's an interesting crop. It makes the economy go round for many poor countries in the world, in the tropics, that can grow huge amounts of yellow bananas in particular for export to the Western market. They've kind of got a problem in that every yellow banana that you buy from any given supermarket is a variety called Cavendish, and you might get them in various degrees of length or bendiness, but they are all Cavendish. One of the issues is that Cavendish has recently been susceptible to pest and disease, and because there's very little genetic diversity left, if we're growing one variety, then it's not possible to go back to other varieties and to look for ones that might be resistant to pests and diseases. So they have a real problem, and there is a danger that that the Cavendish banana could get wiped out by a really serious pest. So it's important to preserve natural biodiversity, even if it's not immediately obvious why you should grow that plant, because it doesn't crop as well, because perhaps it doesn't taste as nice, but it might have other properties that are really important, that through a breeding program you could introduce, say, the pest-resistant parts of a native plant into the cultivated variety, and therefore introduce greater amounts of pest resistance, resistance to abiotic stress, ability to grow in harsher environments. And so it's extremely important that we preserve the natural biodiversity across the planet.